I'm a horror fan. I haven't really explored my fanaticism for horror on this channel before, so I want to do it now. The classic horror movie monsters are known by everybody. Frankenstein's monster, Mr. Hyde, the Mummy, the creature from the Black Lagoon, I guess. I mean, I see a lot of people say that when they do these lists and talk about that, but he had like one movie, and he wasn't that frightening. I don't understand that. And of course, vampires. So today, as a start of me talking more about horror and genre fiction in general, we're going to be talking about vampires. Disclaimer, this video is not for big vampire fans. If you are big into vampires and gothic horror in general, then a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about in this video you'll already know, and you won't learn anything. So maybe, if you already know about Elizabeth Bathory, the original vampire stories, the origins of the more romantic vampires, and all that stuff, maybe watch some of my other videos and some of the videos I will be making. Subscribe for the videos I will be making more about other genre fiction and gothic horror, continuing on into the future. As a child, I was only exposed to vampires in a couple ways. The Count from Sesame Street and Count Orlok from Nosferatu: A Symphony of Horror. My father showed me that film when I was around 6 or 7, and it scarred me for life. It was one of the most frightening things I had ever seen, and I rarely watch it to this day, mainly because it's not that I get scared, it's more that I want to preserve that memory. And it is still frightening, but more for the aesthetic rather than the actual fear. Vampires came from old European folklore and myths. This is quite true and quite obvious by the fact that so many European folklores and myths have, at the very least, vampiric entities within vampiric elements, but they're not always the vampires that we think of today. And it was, of course, very prevalent that there's often recorded cases of people being dug up and staked and bricks shoved into their mouths because the poor peasants thought they were vampires. The word vampire wasn't really used for these, though. These old myths were the striga, the strigoi, the vraikolakis. Bone-chilling. The one most like modern-day vampires, from the research I've done, is mainly the strigoi, because they had the invisibility and turning into animals thing. But then there's some depiction of them that are just like a head with wings, but maybe that was just one of the books I had called them strigoi when strigoi were something else. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But strigoi are also immortalized in one of my favorite Powerwolf songs, Armada Strigoi. This old, more animalistic style of vampire is completely different from anything we'd see in right up until probably this last century that's just went by 18 years ago. The first real vampire novel started off as a fragment of a novel written by the infamous Lord Byron that was later adapted by his personal doctor John William Polidori into the full length, the short story, The Vampire. This had one of the first vampires with like the lordly, womanizing type that they go around and they do what they want and they blend in to society, and he was called Lord Ruthven. Lord Ruthven was very elegant and was reportedly based on Byron himself. However, in the original fragment story, the vampire was not this debonair lord, it was an old man, and this old man was nothing like what we see here. So the vampire tropes, a lot of them we have today, come more from the personality of Lord Byron than this original story, like the original that the storybook, The Vampire, is based off of. However, we see one of the problems with one of the things that always comes up when talking about vampires: Twilight hate. People hated on Twilight a lot because their vampires weren't tough enough and they were, going around getting involved with women. That was one of the main things about vampires. Lord Ruthven in this original novel One of his main characteristics is that he womanizes. So much so it's kind of the major plot, is that he's a womanizer. Not a vampire. The vampire part's not that big a deal. Well, it's a big deal, but it's the womanizing that kicks the plot into motion rather than him being a vampire. He's not zipping around and killing people. He's not hiding in hedgerows and stalking his prey like Dracula. He's just kind of hanging around and fucking. It's a lot more Edward Cullen than Vlad von Karstein. The next book that is kind of popular before Dracula would be 1871's Carmilla. Carmilla? Carmilla, who actually is the inspiration for Warhammer's Karnstein, because she was Camilla von Karnstein. GW does not create anything original. However, this was one written by an Irish author too. It was one of the first novels that made the whole link between vampirism and sexuality, because the plot is a lesbian vampire is trying to get with this female human girl, and the plot happens basically. But the whole lesbian and the vampire thing are tied together as they're both equal reasons why she should be destroyed, so it's kind of a fucked up novel. But it's been revived into a web series. It's apparently very good and is not all, ooh, gay is devil type thing. But it's still apparently a decent novel. I don't know. I haven't actually read it. Dracula in 1897 would then ratify this kind of womanizing thing. This means that the three vampires from the three big early romantic, capital R romantic vampire novels are all kind of womanizers, like Ruthven with his womanizing, Carmilla with her womanizing, and then Dracula, he gets Lucy from the whole hedgerow thing, and then he gets with Mina. So it's kind of sexuality is very tied in with the vampire mythos, and it's one of the few of the horror monsters, quote unquote, that have that. I mean, the Wolfman isn't sexy. Frankenstein's not sexy, unless you're into feet. And I know it's Frankenstein's monster, but people know it as Frankenstein, so I just flip back and forth between the two. The Invisible Man, I mean, isn't sexy, unless you're like the Hollow Man because of its weird rape scenes. Something kind of controversial is what inspired Dracula. What inspired Bram Stoker to create Dracula? Vlad the Impaler is often pointed to this, despite the fact that the only really similarity between the two is that the name. Because Vlad the Impaler's full name was Vlad Dragulia, which means son of the dragon, because his father was Vlad Dracul, which means Vlad the Dragon. But Dracula in the novel lives in Transylvania, whereas Vlad the Impaler was from Wallachia, which is, yes, a Romanian province, but it's like one of the main parts of the Vlad the Impaler quote-unquote story is that when he went to Transylvania, he was imprisoned. Transylvania and Wallachia do not get on, so there's not really any similarities between the two, other than the facts that Vlad the Impaler was reportedly used to dying among his impaled victims, which is complete propaganda. We don't have any actual evidence of this. It's all, stories, because he became like this mythic, folkloric figure rather than this is what he did, and it's all very wrapped up in folklore. One of the other people that may or may not have inspired Dracula was Elizabeth Bathory. She was a Romanian countess or duchess, I can't remember which, who killed upwards of 600 women and girls, reportedly. There's some controversy about that. And cannibalized them, allegedly. Bathed in their blood, very allegedly. Engaged in blood orgies, allegedly. And these folkloric stories may also have inspired the whole Bram Stoker with his things. But it's more likely he just took some of the older Eastern European and Balkan folklore and then combined it with the vampire novels that had already been written, The Fragment, The Vampire, Carmilla, etc. Because vampires weren't invented by Bram Stoker. They were already a thing. There's this misconception that Bram Stoker created the vampire just because Dracula was the most popular one. No, no, he didn't. He just adapted the idea. He didn't need inspiration to come up with vampires. They were already a thing. They'd already been made. Like, Lord Byron had already talked about how he became sick of vampires in some of his other letters and how he didn't really like talking about them that much. I don't like how Bram Stoker gets so much credit. But, again, this shows that the vampires have moved along quite a lot since their more animalistic roots and have become this very, they're more romantic. But that changes as soon as film is introduced. The first vampire film that I've ever seen, and I think that we still have in existence, is Nosferatu, Symphony of Horror. And Count Orlok in this is not at all the romantic, womanizing vampire. He's hideous, he's completely deformed, he looks bat-like, he looks like a monster, and he acts like it. He's completely animalistic. When blood is introduced, he dives for the guy's finger when he gets cut. And yes, it's a Dracula ripoff, but the character itself is not. But the story is, like, so much so that they sued them, the widow of Bram Stoker. But that film, I think, is much closer to the original vampire myths than this raw romantic idea, and is one of the reasons why it terrified me so much, was that the Count Orlok can definitely not stand out in society. The fact that the main character is not immediately terrified by his weird fucking bat-like ears, yes, he does keep them covered, but still, he can't fit in society. It kind of takes a bit away, but he's more representing the plague rather than forbidden sexual appetites, like some of the other ones are. This is also the first film that established the whole killed by sunlight thing. I don't know if it comes up in Carmilla, I haven't read it, but it's not a thing in The Vampire that I can remember, and it's not a thing in Dracula. In Dracula, his power, he just can't use his powers in daylight, and he's almost nocturnal. Also, his wooden stakes are not a thing in the original Dracula either. It's knives, or just silver stakes. It's wooden. I don't know where the wooden stakes come from. I haven't done research that far ahead yet. So that's where sunlight comes from, and that becomes one of the tropes that becomes ingrained in vampires, is that they are killed by sunlight, along with the garlic from Dracula and a bunch of the other stuff. One thing that wasn't kept was the whole OCD thing. In the original myths, if you wanted to keep a vampire in its grave, you poured a bunch of seed or sand in it, because then the vampires are apparently so OCD that they need to count them, and by the time you want to put in so much that by the time they've counted them, they realize it's dawn and it's time for them to go to bed again. I don't know. Kind of odd. These tropes would be subverted into many films and books. Too many to cover in one video. That's why I'm going to make a series of videos about vampires, talking about the different adaptations, the different versions, etc. This was literally just an intro into the kind of the brief history that I'm going to be going into more detail into the vampire, etc., etc. And there's just so many books and films. There's like Dracula 1931, the Bram Stoker's Dracula, Van Helsing, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Dracula 2000, Blade, all these things, and then the Carmilla web series. There's an entire there's channels devoted just to vampire stuff, so that's why I'm not going into massive detail. There's also all the books like the True Blood books, the Anne Rice's vampire books, the vampires in Discworld. I'm going to be doing certain videos on some of these things, but I don't want to go into a massive detail. This is half of doing the history and getting into it, but also just to be able to say I'm going to be making more vampire videos, but also more genre fiction videos. My next video in relation to this is I'm going to be reviewing the 1931 Dracula movie, which I hope I will. I have some of the script done. I need to finish the script, and then we'll see how it goes. It'll probably be next week. Do you like the way I'm kind of moving into the channel with a more genre fiction? I know most of you probably don't care and only watch this because you like to leave comments, but I'm enjoying it because it means I can do research and stuff I want to do, which was a break from the education system I've had to live through most of my life. And I just kind of enjoy it. Like and subscribe to see some of the more genre fiction related stuff, vampire stuff, dwarves, giants, fantasy. I have an entire list of videos I want to do, and I'm hoping to do it weekly, if not 2 a week. Definitely 1 a week. If I have time, I'll do more. I'll probably get 2 out this week. Who knows? I already released 1 video this week, but it was my my channel trailer. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, like and subscribe. And always remember to eat your little children.